Good morning. My name is Brett Pinder. I'm an ordained elder here in the Oregon-Idaho Annual Conference. I work at the annual conference, so my Sundays are free, and I get to spend this one with you. My title at the conference is Strategist for Community Partnerships and Community Engagement. So I get to work with a lot of congregations who are trying to connect to their neighborhoods better. That often means churches who are thinking about or moving into the process of building affordable housing. I get to do that oftentimes in partnership with the Land and Housing Coalition. I get to work with congregations who get to a point where they have to think about sustainability and changing their model of being a congregation, being more of a partnership model. I get to work with congregations and leaders to do community organizing, listening seasons with their neighbors. So I have a pretty fun job. To get to Jesus' feeding of the 5,000, I want to start by talking about giant puppets. Dramatic puppets. Like women weeping, and I can't emphasize enough, giant. Like taking 3 people to handle them, 10 feet tall puppets. Puppets like an Uncle Sam on stilts marching in satirical protest in a 4th of July parade. A giant, bleeding heart Christ with his arms stretched out in embrace of all. Since the 1960s, you could see these puppets at performances from the traveling theater called Bread and Puppet. They were as famous for giving out freshly baked rye sourdough as they were for these giant puppets. At each showing, you would be welcomed with the artist's freshly baked bread, served with aioli dipping sauce. And since the 60s, crowds had viewed performances of these enormous 10 feet tall puppets in shows while breaking bread together as they watched protest shows about wars from the Vietnam War to the invasion of Afghanistan, protesting corporate greed, climate destruction. These folks come to mind, of course, because of their feeding of thousands, 1 loaf of bread at a time, but they also come to mind because they do something more than that I think Jesus is doing with his own feeding of bread. Bread and Puppet has a founding principle that community and joy and art should be as basic as bread to life. What that means is they bring crowds together and they transform them into community with joy and powerful art and, of course, bread. And I don't just mean that they create this neat experience for theater goers. That sentence just totally disappeared from my screen. Where was I? I don't just mean that they create a neat experience for theater goers. Bread and Puppet is credited as being one of the major forces to create a decades-long movement of people speaking out for economic, anti-war, environmental justice. Not only did they do something powerful in each of these gatherings, but they created ripples that helped create waves of people joining together in community to make change. I cut something from the sermon, and I want to tell you about it. We often miss that this feeding of the 5,000 is a protest gathering. This story, I think especially in Mark, comes just a bit after King Herod beheads John the Baptist. The people are grieving. Their world is in crisis. And they follow Jesus out because he's a prolific, engaging teacher. But they just want to be together with this person who is close to their beloved John. That's another one of the reasons that this Bread and Puppet theater group comes to mind. So back to my script. In Jesus' day, in ancient Palestine, Bread was an essential staple, a basic staple for life. And the miracle of the feeding of this 5,000 is about a lot more than there being a lot of lunch to go around. You see, Jesus knew there would be plenty of bread. But this is a miracle about a crowd turned into a community. In Jesus' day, in ancient Palestine, if you were to venture away from home for the day, either to market or to follow some exuberant speaker like Jesus, you would bring along bread. It was the culture. As you walked out the door, you would bring bread, and you would bring along salt-cured fish. It was a reflex. Headed out for the day, pack your bread and fish. So imagine Jesus' surprise when he sends the disciples into the crowd to get a meal started, and all they turn up is 5 loaves and 2 fish. Perhaps indeed this is not just a story about there being a lot of lunch, but a story of a crowd transformed. Jesus turns this crowd of strangers into a community with members contributing from their own giftedness, their own well-being, supporting one another with joy and a meal together, respite from a mad news cycle of a vengeful tyrant. Like the bread and puppet folks, Jesus is setting a table for joy and peace, where community is built to form those things. As the gospel reading we heard begins, the disciples had just finished working and teaching amongst the townspeople, those folks who had gathered with them to grieve and be together. The disciples were tired. They'd been working with the people and processing all that was happening. And so Jesus suggests they head off to a quiet place and find some rest. The problem was, the crowd kept following them. So Jesus turned his attention to the crowd, and he taught them for a while. And after some time goes by, the disciples cut in with, it is getting late. Maybe we should let these guys go and find some rest, eat. Which is to say, the disciples said, Jesus, maybe you could hustle this along so we can rest and eat. Well, when those tired disciples heard Jesus' response, I imagine that they get a little snippy. Why don't you see to them eating, Jesus says. And the disciples assume that coming up with the meal is now their burden. So snippily they protest, are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread? Well, that's not what Jesus had in mind. Jesus saw the crowd as having a possibly insurmountable need to be fed, but Jesus also saw them as gifted and resourced and capable of creating a solution. So Jesus sent the disciples to go and see how many loaves and fish were among them. I can imagine the disciples, tired, moving through the crowd begrudgingly asking how much bread somebody might have thought, and their unenthused, tired, unpleasant attitude creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that didn't quite rouse the crowd's buy-in. And so they turn up just 5 loaves and 2 fish. Imagine Jesus' surprise. But he says that's going to be just enough. And here's where the miracle happens. Jesus tells the disciples to have the crowd sit together, ready to eat. But not just to sit anywhere, not to sit auditorium style facing Jesus. Other gospels include the detail that the people are to sit together in crowds of 50 or 100. What had been a crowd of individuals, each seeking their own moment of grace and healing and teaching, is transformed into a community of people where they're circled up together, shoulder to shoulder, looking one another in the eye, looking across the circle at their fellow humanity, and so bread and fish begin to circulate. A miracle made up of groups of people who are really able to see one another And so it happened maybe with one part people taking a little less than they would have, and another part people adding in more bread and fish than they originally offered up to those skeptical disciples. All of it a little inexplicable, beyond recognizing the power of a crowd turned into a community and believed in to be creative, resourceful, and capable. The miracle isn't that there ended up being a lot of bread and fish. The miracle is that a needing crowd, believed to be more powerful than their problems, and a group of disciples coached by Christ to empower and transform that crowd into a community, one of care and healing and nourishment and joy. I think there's an invitation for us in this story. Our society is so deeply fractured. So many people are feeling effects of economic policies, fear-mongering, police and ICE targeting and disappearing people. And I hear in this story a calling for us as churches to be a part of our neighborhoods, believing that we can be more powerful than the problems we face, creating communities of care and healing and safe harbor and joy and meaning. I originally titled this sermon Bread and Roses. It comes from a song that I think Bread and Puppets named their theater in homage to. It's a song that emerged out of the women's suffrage and labor rights movements. In it, women sing of coming together for justice and community, and beauty and joy. In it, women sing of fighting for rights, for bread, but for roses too. I think this ancient sacred story of Jesus believing that his people had just what they needed to care for one another's needs as they faced hunger in the wilderness, that they had the ability to sit together and build connection needed for community, that they had the ability to see the humanity in one another and find joy and beauty in it too. I think that maybe isn't just an invitation or a calling, but I think it is a blessing upon us. Because just as Jesus believed that of them, I think Jesus believes that of you too. Jesus' invitation is to go looking for what bread and roses and puppets are among us, not just in these walls, but in our communities. To find what joy and hope we have among us. Jesus' blessing upon our joys and hopes is that we have among us what we need to build community and connection and resiliency. I'm told that you are familiar with a practice of turning to do one-to-ones. If not, we're about to take a turn. I want to invite you to find somebody to have a one-to-one conversation with and share what is bringing you joy and hope right now. We'll take a few minutes. And then I want to hear what comes up. So we'll share some of what comes up before we move to our song. It sounds like it. As you're finishing up those last thoughts, I'm curious, what came up in conversation for folks? What are some of the things bring you hope and joy right now? Grandkids. I hear a theme. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
This church, as we went through prior to COVID, even in COVID, we really got to the point where we figured that we're going to have to shut down within a couple of years. We made it through COVID. We've actually come back fairly strong. Our finances are in good shape. We have kept attracting new people. So we're not gangbusters growing, but I'm confident that this church is going to be here for a
Yeah. Great. For air conditioning.